Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome back those who have already attended the previous presentations, and I also welcome those who are just joining us. Welcome to the third of 8 presentations of our webinar for ESL and EFL teachers at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso. Digital Learning and Teaching, Promoting Autonomous Student Learning. Once again, let me introduce myself. My name is Sebastián Adaros. I am a teacher in the English program at PUCV, and I will be moderating this presentation today. This presentation lasts approximately 30 minutes, during which you will be able to write your questions to our speaking using the Zoom chat. Please make sure when you send your questions that they are addressed at everyone so that we can all read them. Questions will be answered during the last 10 minutes allotted at the end of the presentation. I would like now to introduce the speaker of this session. Dr. Gabriel Díaz Maggioli is a teacher who applies the lessons learned in the classroom to his roles as academic advisor, teacher educator, researcher, and author. He currently works in the Institute of Education at Universidad ORT del Uruguay. He is the first Latin American president of the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, IATEFL. Without further ado, I leave you with our speaker, Dr. Gabriel Díaz Maggioli.
Thank you, Sebastián. Hello, everybody. It's quite an honor for me to be here. Thank you very much, Daniela and Claudia, for inviting me to this wonderful event. And I hope that what we will be sharing in the next 30 minutes proves both useful and maybe a little bit inspiring to all of you. Let me share my screen. And I gave this title to my presentation, Survival Strategies for Emergency Remote Teaching. And I would like to start by really positioning what I'm going to talk about in the context of the pandemic, something we have all heard a lot. But one thing we need to realize is that during the past 18 months, what we've been doing is not distance learning, is not blended learning, is not hybrid learning. We've been doing something called emergency remote teaching. And if we define it, we know that it is not the same as distance learning. Distance learning was created quite almost a century ago, or more than a century ago, to provide access to education to those people who didn't have them. But the setup of distance learning is scientific. There's a purposeful instructional design. There are rules and regulations, if you wish, that have to be abided by when we do distance learning that are not captured in this emergency remote teaching situation. Because what is emergency remote teaching? This is a definition that has 2 key words. It's an abrupt change, and it's also a transitory change. Because of these unforeseen circumstances, we have to teach our students in a different way. But the main aim of what we are doing is not to create a robust educational ecosystem. It's not to develop a new way of teaching. Just what we do is to provide temporary access to teaching in a quick way. The consequences of this situation may imply, and let's put it in a very big conditional, might imply that once the pandemic is over, we might have to continue doing this because this may have become a new way of doing education. But we don't have to think about what we are doing as a long-term solution. This is a quick fix solution. And because of that, we need to be very mindful of what we can do as teachers and what students can achieve as learners. To start with, we all know the downside of this situation: lack of technology, lack of connectivity, inadequate teacher preparation. We were not prepared to have to deal with these kind of teaching, but more importantly, lack of student preparation. Students were not necessarily wired for this. And the fact that they are young and they use social media does not mean that they are comfortable in the virtual environment. On the contrary, many times students report anxiety, depression, the inability to actually catch up with the work that we set. And the reason for those problems is, in my humble opinion, a confluence of variables. The fact that we teachers are pressed to deliver a curriculum that has been thought out and planned to be delivered on site over the course of a certain number of months, because we are being given ways of assessing our students which have been created for the on-site environment and not for the online environment. And because students are losing the socializing aspect of schooling, of going to class. And they resent the fact that they don't know their peers. Actually, it's not that they don't know their peers. They cannot get to know their peers in the same depth, with the same depth as they would in an on-site situation. So a few words of warning. It's very easy to get caught in the bells and whistles of having to use technology. There are so many applications over there in the world, free or not free, that it's very easy to fall into the, oh, I will use this new app and I will use this new app and I will create this other video and I will do this or the other. Whistles do not guarantee that students are going to be guilty as charged. I have used it. Who hasn't? Well, feedback from students, at least in my country, has indicated that they are sick and tired of using Kahoot. In the end of semester evaluations in December last year, for the second semester, there was a unanimous cry for, please stop using Kahoot. It's no longer interesting. And that is the fate of apps. Apps are very quickly become outdated. So it's not about the technology that we have to be concerned. We have to be concerned about the pedagogy. Good, solid approach to teaching, which is mediated by technology, not delivered through technology, but mediated by technology. The actual powerful element is a human element still. So you have to remember that it's not about going for the latest technology. The best technology that we have is the one that we already possess and we know how to use. With that and a good pedagogical mindset, the sky is the limit. And last but not least, we have to remember that many apps and many of the trends that are being disseminated because of the pandemic are nothing more than edutainment, educational entertainment. Am I keeping the kids having fun and engaged for the 3 hours of class I have to teach? Well, edutainment does not lead to learning, and there's extensive research that says that. But I think that the linchpin of the current situation is the fact that somehow we're adrift, like this image that I have as a background. We have been adrift for 18 months. And I have been very, very fortunate to be able to work with a lot of teachers over the past 18 months. In my role as a teacher educator, I teach in the BA in English language teaching in the National Teacher Education College. So I teach students who are actually learning to teach English in schools. I go and visit their classes. I do their supervision as well. And I also work with a lot of university faculty, but also because of my role within IATEFL, I have been able to work with teachers across the globe, in all continents. And one thing that one realization that I have come to is that if we want to provide a survival strategy for everybody, and I'm including administrators here as well, administrators, teachers, students, and families, so that we don't experience this situation where the teacher is going crazy, but at the same time, the student is going crazy. We should focus on assessment. Assessment as a way of scaffolding learning. So let's look at, over the next minutes, what I want to do is to focus on assessment, show you how the normal concept of assessment, not normal, but the generalized concept of assessment, when moved into a virtual environment, necessarily needs to change. Even the principles of assessment need to change. And then I want to provide you very clear, concrete strategies so that when you teach and you assess your learners, you achieve that engagement and that learning that we all want. And why do I focus on this and not perhaps on techniques, activities, tasks? Because we can do as much as we want. We can provide students with as many materials as we want. But if they are not aware of where they are, where we are trying to take them, and where we need to arrive, if that awareness is not present for both the teacher and the students, not just the students, right? Then learning doesn't happen. And there is where assessment has a very important role to play. And there's not just one form of assessment, there are 3 forms of assessment. Also, there's the problem that has been reported extensively that the assessments that we do online are not reliable, that there is a lot of cheating, that there's no way to know whether your students are actually doing the work themselves or somebody's doing the work for them. So a lot of those situations can be minimized, not eliminated, minimized, by using a concept of assessment that sees it as a mediational tool and not just as an activity that we have to accomplish by a certain date. So let us get started by looking at some of the principles of assessment. Traditionally, we say that whenever we assess our students, what we are trying to do is to get information about whether they have learned or not. And we use instruments. We use instruments like written tests. We use instruments like guided observation. We use instruments such as tasks that we give them. And all those have to be valid. That is to say, they need to test what has been taught and in the way in which it was taught. They have to be reliable in terms of whether this assessment that I created may yield similar results if applied to a context similar to that of my students, whether the performance of the students, what we get from the assessment is authentic, and whether it is objective. Does it give us a good picture of where students are? So the normal context of assessment implies that we need to have enough high quality information about student learning. We need to a guarantee that that information is trustworthy, that is not just fictitious, and that information is tied to clear performance criteria, which is made public. So students know what they need to learn and how they need to learn it. The teacher knows that, the administrator knows it, and the families and society in general know. Now, this is all very well if we give them a pen and paper test, right? We can apply statistical measures to design the instruments. But when we move online, the situation is compounded. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, we need to think of 3 other things. Congruence. It's very difficult to keep congruent between the way we teach and the way we assess. We need to develop congruence between the way we teach and the way we assess so that the 4 main principles remain relevant. That implies necessarily that there has to be a variety of assessment tools. And more importantly, that there's opportunity for us to give feedback to the students about how they can learn best. So I would like to invite you to think of assessment not as the regular monitoring of student learning, but as a way of finding value in what our students do. And for that, I go to the French word évaluer. What we look for is the value of something. So what we look for is for learning, and learning is not there. Learning is not a finalized product. Learning emerges from students' engagement in activity with the contents and with the language. So let's see how we can promote this kind of learning. The first thing that became very evident very soon is that the performance criteria by which we measure student language learning in virtual situations changes drastically. Through a survey that I applied last year as part of a research project, I came up with 4 patterns or performance criteria that I have seen teachers apply around the world. Many of the activities are oriented towards what I call reproduction. Okay, so you look for comprehension, practice, which is controlled practice of language. And what you aspire to as a teacher is that students can reiterate or repeat what you have taught them. This is natural and it's normal, but it's not enough. Because just by repeating or reiterating things, we don't allow learners to appropriate meaning. A second area of performance is given by elaboration. So what teachers have done online and what has resulted easy is to get students to expand something, to evaluate something, to say whether they agree or they don't agree and why. And also the area of personalization, getting the students to think of how to use that language that we're teaching them to talk about themselves, their lives, and their experiences. A third area of performance that teachers have tried to do is create activities that ask for a reaction on the students, an opinion, solving a problem, or, and this is very interesting, evaluating themselves or evaluating their peers. The last area of performance that has been popularized through virtual education is that of creation, which generally happens offline. It happens in between face-to-face classes. And that is when you ask students to propose something, to invent, or to develop a project. So if you look at these 4 areas of performance criteria, you very quickly see that there are limitations to what students can do. So let's look at how we can promote assessment of learning, that is to say, the assessment of results, the assessment for learning, which is assessment that helps students continue learning, and which helps us teachers plan and improve our teaching, and assessment as learning, which is a dimension very few people talk about, but is an instrumental area of assessment. So let's start with assessment of learning. How do you give students a test? Well, forget about tests. How about we think of communication as possessing 3 modes? There's, of course, the interpretive mode, where students read or listen and show their understanding. There is the presentational mode, where students talk, express themselves orally or in writing. And there's, of course, the interpersonal mode, when students interact orally. There is where communication lies, in the mastery of those 3 modes of communication. So how about we propose something called integrated performance assessment? This is a framework for assessment in languages that does not come from English language teaching. It actually comes from the field of foreign languages, spearheaded by the work of the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, ACTFL. And they started with this in 2008, and there is a lot of bibliography there. What is integrated performance assessment? It's a sequence of tasks. You don't interrupt your teaching so as to assess the students. You embed assessment in your teaching, and this is what I like about IPAs. There are three related tasks, all on the same topic. One, the first one, is either a listening or a reading or both about a topic. And what can you use for that? Well, Google Forms is wonderful. If you use something like Schoology or Canvas or Moodle or Blackboard, there are evaluation tools in those platforms, so you can use those. If you don't have those platforms, you can always go online and find web pages that allow you to create quizzes. That happens in one class, and the following lesson, the teacher gives feedback to the students on the listening and reading and engages them in interactive speaking, to then, in a third lesson, engaging them in presenting or writing. How do you assess this? How do you account for the diversity in students' performance? Well, basically, through using rubrics that are negotiated with learners, that are shown ahead of time, that are shared by the teachers in the same department, in the same institution, where there is clarity as to what is expected of the students. And the rubrics then are not just an assessment tool, they can become a learning guide. We refer to the rubric all the time. The collaborative construction of rubrics with students, like what is a good conversation, what is a good piece of writing, how do you understand a text, engaging the students in the process of doing that is not a waste of time. It's actually a way of getting learners to learn how to learn. So I encourage you to do collaborative construction. Now, if you're going to use those rubrics, it's always good to validate them with other peers, give them to another teacher who teaches the same grade you teach, and say, see if you give them a reading, if it works, if you give them a writing, if it works, etc. That's called validation. And the important thing is that they should be public. If you have a platform, make the rubrics available on the platform from day one. Have a dedicated space for the platform. And be careful how you use the language in the rubrics. It has to communicate exactly what students are supposed to be able to do. How do you achieve that? Through transparency, by using verbs, not something like understanding, or they will understand, or they will comprehend. No, show exactly what students are going to be doing with the language. And then feedback on those rubrics. After you have used them, ask the students, was this useful as a learning guide? This is an example of an IPA, which will have a rubric for each of the three tasks. The interpretive mode is always the first one because we want the students to build background knowledge on the topic. So look at this situation. Your school is going to name the library after a famous English-speaking author from any part of the English-speaking world. Read the biographies of the candidates and complete reading comprehension tasks. You could also do it as a listening, for example. The teacher corrects this, gives feedback to students, and the next lesson is going to be the interpersonal task. And this has to be recorded. How do you record it? Well, everybody has one of these, or almost everybody, or at least one every two students will have this. And we have programs like WhatsApp. So when you give them the task, you tell them, record it on your cell phone, and then send it to me through WhatsApp. The interpersonal task that you see is connected to the interpretive task is with a partner agree on the name of one of the people in the list and say why you chose this author over the others. That is the interpersonal task. And the last one is the presentational phase, where students need to show that they can articulate with the language, either in writing or speaking. And there you have write a letter of nomination to the school principal, defending your choice of author and giving reasons for your choice. So this is a form of assessment of learning or summative assessment, which has many advantages. I'm not going to go into them. I'm just going to show them to you. But it takes us away from the idea of a paper and pencil test. It also allows us to start thinking of another form of assessment for learning. And this is assessment, which I call online, that we do all the time when we are teaching, right? It focuses on the process. It involves a constructed response. It's criterion based. Well, you have the characteristics, you have them. Now, in the online environment, to all those characteristics, I have discovered through my engagement in teaching and my supporting other teachers that assessment for learning is best construed as a sequence where the students make an attempt and they receive feedback on that attempt. They act on that feedback through self-correction or peer support. They edit and then they submit. So assessments that allows us to do things like, for example, right, using a class agenda at the end of the lesson to assess whether students have learned something. Using brainstorming apps like Mentimeter to see what students can say or do. Using applications that allows them to create mind maps, getting the students to paraphrase, to say in their own words what they have understood, using the famous KWL chart that everybody uses frequently. What do I know about animals? What do I want to learn? And then at the end of the lesson, you ask them to complete the last column, what have we learned? Asking them to provide one-sentence summaries of what we have said or learned. And the concept, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of 3 times practice or demand high practice, which means we do activities in the class, we correct them, they give us the response, like what is number 1, what's number 2, what's number 3. But then after every response, you extend the output of the students. This works very well, for example, for the very shy students. Like, for example, a student, you have done an activity where a student described a room, right? And you revise the vocabulary about, I don't know, architectural features of the room. If you have shy students, they are not going to want to participate, maybe give you the answer to the activity. But then after you have provided feedback, students are more likely to participate in things like that extend their understanding. For example, you could say, okay, if we're talking about crown molding for this room, in which kind of rooms do you see crown molding in your everyday life? If you go out into the streets, for example. And then the third time of practice is personalization. Like, what is your favorite kind of crown molding? Do you have crown molding in your home? I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, the School of Architecture as a reference. But there you see, there you have it. What happens with assessment for learning? We can do things with Zoom or Teams or Meet. You can see there is a grid behind. Wait a minute, I'm trying to look at the. Good. You see, this is a grid of what a Zoom or Teams gather review may look like. So what do I do with this? How do I use this for no preparation assessment for learning? We start with asking the students, yes, to switch their cameras off. And then we ask them to rename themselves. So instead of their name, they can write about the foggiest point, the thing in the class that they haven't understood so far. You could play battleships where you have the rows of students that you see and the columns. The columns have A, B, C, D, and the rows have 1, 2, 3, 4. So the teacher nominates a student according to what the teacher has in his or her screen, because as students interact, the screens change. And everybody's screen has a different view. And this is a beautiful thing about this. With battleships, you say, for example, okay, B3. And the B3 student is Angelica. And you ask a question to Angelica. And then Angelica says a number-letter combination and asks her own question to the others, right? And that is what we call battleships. Then the other thing that they can write instead of their name is the 3 to 1, 3 things that you learned today, 2 things that you still have questions about, and 1 thing that you are going to use the next time you speak in English. could be a word, an expression, giving them the time to process that. So assessment of learning, for learning, and now we have to look at assessment as learning, which is nothing else but self-assessment and peer assessment. There's a movement in the United Kingdom and throughout Europe called Looking for Learning, and they focus on asking students questions that are recursive. That is to say, we use the same questions over and over again, and they suggest some categories that can help students self-assess and assess their peers. If you want to know whether they are learning, these are the questions. If you want to know whether the learning is adequate, these are the questions. If you want to know if the learning is enough, these are the questions. And if you want to know whether the context has an influence on learning, those are the questions. As you can see, this is awareness raising. It's about myself as a learner. The information that I get helps me learn because I need to provide metacognitive support to what I'm doing in the terms of actions. So we have these three ways of gathering information about student learning while we are teaching, right? This is not something that we stop teaching and we do on a special day. This is assessment embedded in learning activities. Then what do we do with this? Basically, we need to provide students with feedback, right? I have a friend who teaches in International House Porto, who has this beautiful quotation: feedback is the reward that your students expect for the work that they have completed, right? And how do we do feedback? Well, basically, what feedback should do is reduce the gap between what the students are able to do now and what they should be able to do. And I bring you back to the rubrics and how the rubrics detail different levels of performance. And when we look at how to give feedback to students, we need to show that we care, an honest, caring attitude, where you see the first moment is a clarification moment. If you are not sure about the student's performance, ask them. Secondly, the next movement in giving feedback is say everything the student has done well, something we don't do enough of. And this can be done through a chat, through a message on the platform, through a WhatsApp message, through any means that you want to communicate to learners, or one-to-one if you have the chance. After you have questioned them if you didn't understand something, said everything they did great, tell them also what they did wrong. And don't overwhelm them. Describe everything they did wrong, but they won't be able to change everything they did wrong once. So what we do is we empower the students by focusing on 2 or 3 things that need immediate attention. And we don't just tell them these are the 3 things you need to improve. We help them as students reflect. Okay, I'm looking at the chat because I'm not sure about the timing, Sebastian, right? So if we go through this showing that you care method of providing feedback, what we do is we create a habit of mind in ourselves that allows us to actually economize in time and resources when we provide feedback. But because we have a method, right? Because we have a specific method of providing feedback, you are looking at the learning of the students from the same vantage point. And that is unparalleled. If you want to read more about feedback, I recommend the work of Brookhart, and I'm going to give you my references. And I share these pointers with my students in teacher education courses, because to me, they are the best summary that anybody could have created about what to do and what not to do when you're providing feedback. And Brookhart gives us this: focus the feedback on the response, on the task, but not on the learner. Be specific and clear with feedback messages. Use language that students know. If you need to give the feedback in Spanish, do. Keep feedback as simple as possible. Promote learning goal orientation. Don't think that, I mean, when we provide feedback, it's not that the student is a bad student. The student couldn't do a particular task in a particular way. Provide feedback after the learners have provided their own solution, right? And use self-referent feedback when appropriate. If students start saying, but when you corrected Johnny, no, it's let's look at your performance before and your performance now. That is what we call what we mean by self-reference. And this works with very little children and with very old adults. It's a wonderful way of providing students moral, emotional, and affective support for their learning. And last but not least, check that the students have understood the feedback, but not just like asking the question, have you understood? No, like, well, explain to me what we have agreed on, what I have explained to you in terms of your feedback. Of course, in the same way that there are feedback do's, there are feedback don'ts. And I'm not going to go into them, but I'm going to show them to you. More on Brookhart when I give you the bibliography at the end. Basically, what we intend to do is to provide students with another scaffold, another support for their learning. And remember that the purpose of scaffolding is not, it is not to simplify the task for the students, but to help them reclaim ownership over the activity so that they can do it in a more autonomous way. Now, I hope that you understood that the way we are looking at teaching in this emergency remote situation is a particular non-conventional way of teaching, and that you remember that going forward, this has to be more scientifically structured. It has to be, and there are a lot of frameworks for preparing synchronous or asynchronous lessons in the same way as there are many tools. The important thing to remember is that you gather the information with the students during learning as a part of the learning. You share that information with students, you make them reflect on that information about their own learning, you provide them feedback that supports changes in their learning, and then what do? Well, you have to be able to provide corrective activities. It's not just about gathering relevant information, giving feedback, and that's it. You have to devote class time not to covering more, to simply provide corrective feedback so as to make sure that students have learned this and they can move forward. What kind of corrective activities? Simple ones. You can reteach the same thing using a different way. Change one thing, the kind of presentation, the kind of engagement. As I said, restating the original explanation louder and more slowly won't help, right? Find another way of doing it. I have been very successful by having students teach a lesson, design a language learning activity. We did something that came in the course book. We did the famous read the text and answer the questions. And then I asked the students, okay, create a vocabulary activity, create a meaning activity, create a digital activity to show understanding of the text. You give them the chance and they fly. Another way that we could do it is providing individual tutoring. That, of course, we don't have the time to do it for all the learners, but also think that this kind of corrective activities is not for the majority of the learners that you have. It's for those who are really struggling. So consider whether you can devote time to this individual tutoring. If you have students in higher levels, you can engage them in some peer tutoring scheme, right? Or people from the same class, maybe you have some students in your lesson who study English privately, they can help their peers. And if you don't want to devote that, consider creating a virtual cooperative team space where students working in groups of 3, at least 3, and no more than 5, all with different levels, get together to do the same activities we did in the classroom, the same activities. But what happens there is in this cooperative team, they are learning from one another, right? And if they need you, they can call you. I do that as a norm for 5 minutes, non-stop minutes, right before the end of the lesson, as a way of consolidating, of getting the students to get an idea of the takeaways they get from the lesson. And that's the other kind of advice that I have for you. Think in terms of units of work, modules, and made up of individual lessons. Reframe your learning outcomes. Ponder and discuss with your friends, with your colleagues, with your administrators and your students, what is feasible in the situation in which we are. We know we are going to have to do a lot of corrective activities after we go back to face-to-face or this pandemic ends. So let's focus on what the students can achieve, can realistically do. That means that maybe the syllabi have to be shortened. That means that maybe a sequence of 3 courses will now have to extend to 6. I know there are many considerations that you need to take into consideration. But remember this, it's not just about measuring the students to classify them, those who can and those who can't, right? Remember what Einstein said. Sorry. Everything that can be measured does not always count. And what really counts cannot often be measured. So think in terms of that. What counts as learning for your students in your context, in your institution, and with your particular needs? So my colleagues, my dear colleagues, here is my list of references. If you want to know more about integrated performance assessment, the work of Adair, Hack, Gleason, and others is very interesting. In terms of giving effective feedback, Brookhart's book through ASCD, a real piece of jewel. If you want to know more about integrated performance assessment, I have a chapter in a wonderful book that came out last year, Changing Language Assessment, New Dimensions, New Challenges. I'm at the moment writing a book in Spanish called Pantallas y Pizarrones, Enseñar a Aprender en la Virtualidad for the Santillana Publishing Group. We hope it's going to be ready by December and be launched next year. And then the work of Hattie, who has done amazing meta research on research of what works and what doesn't work. Hattie's ideas are amazing, and they consider that one of the most effective ways of promoting learning is by giving students feedback. And without further ado, I open up the floor for questions. How are we doing, Sebastian?
Yeah, we're doing perfectly with timing. In fact, we're going to have some extra time for questions, which is fantastic because
Wonderful.
I imagine there are going to be plenty of them. I already have 2 questions, and I will keep 2 questions from the audience, and I will keep an eye on the chat. So please write down your questions to Dr. Diaz. So the first one is a very practical question from Roger Hernandez. He asks whether you could send the slides to the audience, please.
Oh, absolutely. I will make sure that Claudia gets them and she can distribute them. I will send them as a PDF because otherwise the animations, and I may take out the pictures, otherwise it's not easy to send through email, but I will send it after my talk today, or let's say by next Monday.
Right, fantastic. Thank you very much. We also have a question by Adriana Cango, and she asks, so her question is, should the assessment principles be aligned to the 3 components of the lesson plan?
I don't know what you mean by the 3 components of the lesson plan. If you could clarify that, I would be able to give you an answer. Please use the chat for that so that I can see it.
And in the meantime, while she is writing the clarification on her question, we have a question by Veronica Ormeño. And she's asking, she's asking, how can we engage students in self and peer assessment that shows a true reflection on their part? there is sometimes a tendency for them to be self-indulgent.
Oh, absolutely. I think that what the linchpin there is to negotiate the assessment criteria with them so that they realize what is expected of them. If I may digress for a little, for a minute, Veronica, I'm finishing up a research project that we undertook as part of our research mandate in the university. We use design-based research as a methodology, it's a qualitative methodology. And what happened was we noticed that even though we did the construction of the assessment criteria with the students themselves, they didn't use it, right? So what happened there? And we undertook that as a learning community kind of project, teachers and students together exploring that. And things that have surfaced is they don't recognize their own role as assessors of their own performance. They are very cruel when they assess their peers, and they are overindulgent, as you say, when they assess themselves. However, if we build the criteria together, and the criteria is transparent in terms of, for example, I would be very willing to share the rubric for online classes that we negotiated with some of my students this year, right? That spells out clearly what is expected, and it has 4 levels of performance. And then if you ask the students to provide you with evidence of that, the way that I do it is this way. I have a Google form that I created at the beginning of the year. And I always have the same questions. What did you learn today that you didn't know before? What did you learn today that you already knew? What would you need help with? And what and who can you help with? The first thing there at the beginning is the date. So that we have 30 classes a year, 15 classes per semester. So instead of having class 1, 2, 3, we put the day so that we know what we dealt with in each class. And these are 3 or 4 hour lessons, depending on the level. They answer those questions. And then at the end, I ask them, what grade would you give your performance in today's class? And what would you change? Then every time we do formal assessments, which because of the college we have to do, I have the question, what grade do you expect to get in this assessment and why? These are all ways of minimizing the overindulgence. And another way is by having examples of good, mediocre, and bad performance in the tests, in the activities, in the projects. And we discuss them, we show them before creating the criteria so that they know what is expected. I know it's difficult, Vero, but it can be done.
Thank you. We also have a question by Gabriela Zurdo, and she's asking, can you repeat the name of the upcoming book in Spanish?
Se llama Pantallas y Pizarrones, y es un proyecto que empezamos a pensar con la gente de Santillana para Uruguay. Es para Uruguay, decididamente como un proyecto para los profes uruguayos. Pero supongo que va a estar available online as an ebook as well. I'm not advertising it. I don't know if we're going to, one of my intentions is to offer this at either for free or at a very reduced price. And if there are any royalties coming to me as an author, I'm donating those royalties to language teaching organizations because I think we all need to support one another.
Thank you. We have a question by Norman Diaz.
Yes.
He's asking, what is the best way to teach review units? For example, if I taught unit 1, unit 2, and unit 3, how would it be recommendable to teach the review of those units in one lesson?
The review units are always a splinter in our feet, in our shoes. I'm very pragmatic. I honestly, in the teaching context where I am working now, we don't work with review units, but let me tell you what I used to do. And one thing I didn't say is I've been doing distance learning and remote teaching since 1997 in Uruguay with teachers and with students, and both in Uruguay and in other places. And over these years, you learn things because you go to events, you share things with friends. So what was the question again? Sorry, I'm trying to hurry up.
The question was about review units.
Have you heard of choice boards? No, choice boards are a very simple document. It's a table, right? That you create digitally, like a Google Doc. And at the end of, for example, 2 units, you need to do a review unit. You give the students choices so that they can self-select, and that is tied up to self-assessment. They can self-select what they want to do. Some of your students, I don't do the units in class, first thing, synchronously. I do them asynchronously. So sometimes the choices could be do the whole of page 92 or the whole of page 93, or select an activity to review X, or change activity number 3 and give it to a friend to complete. So I give them choices on what to do with those review pages. What I do make sure that we do after that time has been completed is we devote a class to the topic of that review unit. And I create a sample integrated performance assessment, a sequence of 3 tasks that we do in the same lesson, taking the main contents of the review unit, right? But I find that the choice boards are a wonderful thing. And with my teacher education students, they work amazingly well, right? The choices could be, they can even record an audio as an answer to your, to one of the activities in the review units. Review units are basically very controlled, right? And exercises tend to have a right or wrong answer. So you need to imbue them a little bit of expression, and using a program such as an app such as Flipgrid, or using Padlet, if need be, you can use those things to get students more in a more interactive way.
Thank you. Before reading the next question, I would just like to let you know, Dr. Diaz, that there are plenty of messages praising the presentation and thanking you for what you have shared with us. And the next question is by Usim Espinosa, and he's also praising you before the question, and then he asks, could you talk about how much time students should spend receiving and reflecting on feedback?
Again, it's so contextual. Let me give you an example of what I do. And I would have liked to show you the learning management system, the units of work, but I didn't ask permission from my students, so I cannot share them. But in general, what I do is I create what I call key signpost tasks. I don't give feedback on a fill in the blanks exercise. I don't give feedback on activities which are mechanical or which are meaningful but not meaning making activities. I create those tasks, signpost tasks, which may be creating a poster, a semantic map, a mind map, completing a graphic organizer, things in which students have to work collaboratively or individually, but doing something with the language, right? I tend to stay away from asking them to write something, because in general, they don't like that. But if you tell them, I don't know, record a podcast on a topic, or record a video, create a multimedia poster using any of the apps that we have, that works very well. When I give them feedback, I try to do it in writing. Why in writing? With an oral reinforcement, right? Our platform allows us to do the written feedback and also record a message for everything that students submit. And I make sure that I follow the care model, right? And I end up with the E moment. I don't do it until the student responds to me. So sometimes I spend about 5 to 10 minutes creating the feedback for each student. And I expect the student to be able to go over the work that I have given them feedback on and coming back with their own idea of how to improve it. What do? They can write to me on the platform, or they can also record me a message. And it is only when the students have given me that I say, okay, Sebastian, I feel that you can improve A, B, and C. We can focus on this now. To improve A, go and do this. To improve B, go and do this. To improve C, go and do this. And as I say, many times you correct or mark work, and there's not much that students need to improve, whereas other students will need to improve a lot, right? And if you see something which is a pattern in all the students, that is an indication that your teaching has not been effective, right? So I don't give feedback to individual students in that case. I give feedback to everybody, right? Through a message or an oral message or a written message.
Thank you. I think we still have time for one or two more questions. So
Go
if
ahead.
anyone there in the audience still has any other questions to ask, please don't be shy about it. Write them down in the chat. And I think that here we have a question by Roger Hernandez. He says, even when we give simple readings during this ERT, how can we fight against Google Translate? when they have to write something, some students think in Spanish and use Google Translator.
I know. You cannot fight it. You cannot fight it. One thing that has worked for some of my students has been, I tell them that when they enter my classroom, they think that they are entering a democracy, but they are not. They are entering a mild dictatorship where I am like Santa Claus. I know who's been naughty and who's been good. So I know that you have used Google Translate. So when I give them the feedback, I try to arrange a one-to-one tutorial. And I'm telling you this for language learners, but think of this as students of pedagogía who literally cut and paste from the internet, from El Rincón del Vago and things of the sort, some of the assignments, right? When I mean, as a teacher, I know the language, the expressive capabilities of each of my students. So you cannot fool me. If during the course, during the classes, you are silent, when you have to write something on the chat or in an assignment, you cannot put three words together, and then all of a sudden you give me something which is fully structured, I'm going to ask you to prove that you can do it. So one of the ways I discourage students from doing that is I say that everybody who completes the work cannot only complete it online or send it to me through email or through WhatsApp. When we are in class synchronously, I'm going to ask a question about the work that they did at random. So we start the class. In general, I use Zoom or something similar, depending on the institution for which I work. And when the students arrive in my class, the first thing that they see is an image that has a do now activity, right? The do now activity introduces the topic of the day. Then they have the agenda, and the first 10 minutes of the agenda are devoted to review, right? Review of previous classes. I'm a strong believer in what is called the interactive upfront lesson, where you start every lesson with a review, you end it with finding the takeaways, and then every week you provide a review of the week, and then every month you provide a review of the month. I think that that intentionality helps consolidate learning. And then at random during the class, I stop and say, okay, now we're going to do a ping pong of questions and answers on your assignment. So, Sebastian, what did you mean when you say X? And of course, you put them, many of them, Of course, they switch their microphone, they switch off their cameras, or they simply leave the meeting. But then the next time they are not going to do it. I don't believe in punishment. I appeal to the responsibility of the students. And I know that, of course, it doesn't work with everybody, right? It doesn't work with everybody, but slowly the message gets there. So tell them, I know exactly that this was Google Translate. Now I want you to explain that to me in your own words. If you want to get the grade, for example, I don't know.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diaz. Even though we
Please.
have another question, we do not have any more time left, so we're going to have to wrap up here. Unfortunately, because it has been a wonderful presentation and a wonderful round of answers to the audience's questions. So once again, we thank everyone for your participation, and of course, we thank our speaker, Dr. Diaz. It has been quite a pleasure. We also remind you that at the end of the 2 days of presentations, you will be able to download the diploma of participation. We also invite you to join us with our next speaker, Sebastián Arriagada, with Digital Learning and School Inclusion, Designing Experiences for All Students at 3 p.m., following the link on our website. Please meet us at 3 o'clock for the presentation. Thank you very much and have everyone a nice afternoon.